was not doing as well as my kids were, however. I was approaching 300 pounds, and I spent every waking minute either thinking about food or eating food. Other people were not only commenting on it, but fully engaged in fat shaming. I was at a children's Christmas party at Newcomers Club with the girls. Someone I barely knew came up with me and asked me if Stacy was my daughter. I said she was. The woman said, "Is she adopted?" I responded, "No, I know she doesn't look like me because she has blonde hair and blue eyes, but she is my natural daughter." "No, that's not what I mean," the woman said. "I mean that you're so fat and she's so thin. Is that because you steal food off her plate?" I felt like I'd been kicked in my more than ample gut. It is hard to believe that anyone could be so insensitive without having evil intent. So that was around the time I started therapy. And then I start talking about my relationship with my therapist. Fairly early on, I became embarrassed because I was starting to feel like I must be a lesbian because I was falling in love with her. Eventually, I decided to take the risk of telling her. First of all, she told me, "If you were a lesbian, you probably would have noticed that by now." She told me not to worry about it, that it just meant I wanted to feel close. That didn't sound so bad, but I was doubtful. I thought about her, worshipped her, and had the constant urge to buy her and make her presents. I didn't feel like I just wanted to feel close. I felt kind of obsessed. Most of the time, I was convinced that she was completely superior to me, but if she said or did anything I misinterpreted or I felt was wrong, my anger would also be completely disproportionate to the situation. The more we talked about my issues, the worse I started to feel. My friend was a psychologist, and she told me before I started, "Just remember, it's going to get much worse before it gets better." I was surprised by how much worse it got, but my friend's warning really did help me tough it out. I couldn't believe how much pain I was in. I couldn't stop crying. I felt like an elephant was sitting on my chest, crushing me. I felt so sick that I couldn't eat. I forced myself to eat one bowl of cereal at 3 o'clock every day, afraid that my therapist would hospitalize me in a loony bin if I continued to eat nothing at all. Over the next several months, I lost 70 pounds. Carol kept trying to get me to slow down in my treatment, but somehow I was bent on barreling forward. I remember she told me once, "Usually I have to tell my clients to think about what we talked about. With you, I want you to try not to think about it so much." By then, I was writing everything down multiple times a week, thinking if I could just get it off my chest, I would finally feel better. Instead, I was making myself feel worse and worse. The more I tried to resolve it, the more overwhelmed I became by how much pain I was in. Nevertheless, I did gradually improve. The therapy worked in exactly the opposite way that I had initially envisioned it. Instead of accepting how bad I was in order to improve, it was primarily about discovering how human and acceptable I was. I felt more space to be kind to myself and others, and less angry, finally free of the cage of my own defensiveness. In many ways, I was always kind to others, certainly more kind than I'd been to myself. But I had also been self-absorbed due to my own pain and not always able to be aware of some of the ways in which others had been negatively impacted by this. Ed was very supportive as I went through this process, but I worried about the children. I was still functioning well as a mother, but there was no way I could be as emotionally available to them as I wanted to be. Sometimes I needed to go in my room because I would start crying. Despite my efforts to protect the kids from seeing this, I understood that they would notice that I'd been crying anyway. I trusted Ed to be able to take up the slack. One time when Stacy was about 11, she came into my room, saw me crying, and said, "Mom, is something wrong, or is it just more therapy shit?" It's just more therapy shit, honey, I assured her. She was amazingly intuitive.